Okay, it's Cat Shades here again, and for any of you who care, I'm gonna tell you how I got into death metal today. So yeah, some people ask, how did you get into death metal? Because to most people's ears, it's just an indiscernible ball of noise, and it's not possibly enjoyable by anyone. But I would liken it to drug use. You start with the softer stuff, the gateway drugs, and then you move on to harder drugs. So I suppose Metallica would be like the weed, and Slayer would then be the coke, and bands like Mortician and Cryptopsy, that would be the musical equivalent of shooting speedballs. Now, my father is what you would call a boomer. He was born in the 1940s. So at the time of this recording, though, anybody over 25, I guess, is considered a boomer now. So back then, it was considered if you were born in the 40s or 50s, you were part of the baby boom generation. But now it's just if you understand the difference between a man and a woman, then you're an out of touch boomer. But let's get back to music here. So my dad was listening to classic rock, at the time when I was a little boy. He especially liked Pink Floyd. Pink Floyd The Wall, I recall loving that album when I was like 3 years old. And when I was five, I begged my dad to take me to see The Wall, the movie, which was in the theaters at the time. And he took me, and when we got home, my mom bitched him out. So that was not cool on my mother's part, for sure. So yeah, I was born in 1977. My family lived out in a rural area of Western Ohio. We did not have cable TV. Rock radio wasn't playing anything heavier than Guns N' Roses at the time. In 1989, our well to do neighborhood that was out in the country finally got cable. So I would check out MTV, and of course, I was listening to whatever cheesy pop music they had on at the time. And my first experience with like what you would consider a heavier rock band at that time would have been Faith No More, The Real Thing, that album. And then 1990, Alice in Chains' Facelift album. I first heard that in the Man in the Box video. I was floored by that. It was great. And I was totally hooked at that point. Now, fast forward to the fall of 1991. During a 6 week period, Nirvana, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, and Metallica would all release albums that would be massively successful. I still remember the first time. Quick story about Nirvana. Me and my father were watching Saturday Night Live, and I told my dad to flip it to Headbangers Ball, a music show on MTV where they play somewhat heavy music. I'll get to it in a second. But we first saw the Nirvana Smells Like Teen Spirit video on Headbangers Ball. And after a couple minutes of watching, my dad would typically want to flip it back to Saturday Night Live, but he was just stuck on the screen like neither of us nobody never seen or heard anything like that in our lives, and it was just a moment you had to have been there to experience it. And after the video was over, my dad said, "Oh, that guy's on drugs," but he became a Nirvana fan too. We had to make a 45-minute drive to Dayton, Ohio to buy the Nevermind album. But let's get back to heavy metal, shall we? So yeah, MTV Headbangers Ball was a 3 hour block of heavy metal videos every Saturday night from 11 p.m. till 2 in the morning. That it may have been a little bit different during certain times, but anyhow, back then you had to sit through 4 or 5 videos from Poison or Bang Tango or whatever glam band they had back then to get to a decent video. And Headbangers Ball also had a major problem playing music that was already overplayed, like Guns N' Roses and Def Leppard and Aerosmith. Bands that are decent, but you already see plenty of that. Give us something underground for these 3 hours. When you hear people talk about the good stuff about that show, the nostalgia part of that show, they're probably leaving out the bad parts, all the lame videos you had to sit through to get to that one good video that made it all worthwhile. And so, yes, it was at this time I was getting into Metallica. Now, before Metallica's Black Album in 1991, I was aware of the name Metallica because all the bad kids would be wearing Metallica shirts. Um, They would be, smoking cigarettes, and they'd have long hair, probably mullets, because, in rural Ohio at the time, mullets were still very popular. I had a mullet too. And the funny thing about these bad kids is by the time we'd all turned 18, which would have been 1995, by that time, all the kids who were into Metallica had got into rap music. They cut their hair short, started wearing baggy pants, and started saying like, "Yo, what's up? D's nuts, homie. Yeah, hell yeah." And stuff like that. So these people changed with the times and the trends, whereas I just got into heavier music rather than rap music. So back to 1991. Yeah, everybody's sick of Enter Sandman now, but at the time, that song and Metallica themselves were hugely influential in drawing heavy metal to a new level of popularity to which it would never have been without Metallica or that song. That level of visibility and commercial acceptability of metal is entirely upon Metallica. So Metallica was my gateway band, and shortly after that, I discovered, Slayer and Megadeth, Pantera, and all those bands on Headbangers Ball. Beavis and Butthead. Now that show at the time was also huge for heavy metal. Beavis and Butthead's characters weren't really trendsetters so much as they were signs of the times. Like I was at the same age that Beavis and Butthead would have been at the time, and at the time, I was the same way. I wanted to hear heavier stuff. I hated glam rock. I was very opinionated on what I enjoyed. So bands like Winger, were blaming Beavis and Butthead for the downfall. When the fact is, Beavis and Butthead were just a sign of the times. They did not, they weren't setting the trends. They were just, there at the same time. So I think my first exposure to death metal may have been the Sepultura song, the video, Desperate Cry. At that time, say what you will now, but at the time, Sepultura was universally considered a death metal band by everybody. And maybe now they call them thrash or, who knows what. But at the time, it was roundly agreed that Sepultura was a death metal band. And also, I believe at the time I'd seen the video for The Philosopher by Death. So by this time, it's like early 1993. I'm watching Headbangers Ball, and I'm starting to see a lot of death metal videos that I really, really liked. So here's a short list of other videos that I recall seeing on Headbangers Ball between late 93 and early 94. Carcass, Heartwork, Morbid Angel, Rapture and God of Emptiness, Entombed, Hollow Man and Wolverine Blues, Obituary, The End Complete, Napalm Death, The Plague Rages. Back then, Napalm Death was sort of considered a death metal band between Harmony Corruption and some of their other 90s albums. And Cannibal Corpse, Staring Through the Eyes of the Dead. Now, the exposure that Cannibal Corpse got from that video, even though it was only played twice, was huge. I think this exposure may have been even bigger for them than having their part in Ace Ventura. If it wasn't for that, the Bleeding would not have had the success that it had. The only band that I can think of, the only death metal band I can think of at the time that was able to achieve massive success without a video would have been Deicide. And I got into Deicide by borrowing a Legion cassette from a friend of mine. Let me move to the next page here. So aside from Headbangers Ball, the only other way to find, that kind of underground music was to go to a CD shop at like the mall or whatever. But it was pretty rare, and you'd have to ask the clerk what kind of death metal you have, and chances are the clerk would be like, stick their noses up in the air, especially if it was a woman. But usually the men working behind the counter would be like, no, I listen to smart people music like REM or whatever garbage they would listen to. And if you wanted a death metal CD, you had to like special order it. And sometimes, you tell them to special order something and they wouldn't get it. And man, it was just such a pain in the ass to find music back then. You would occasionally find out about live music events, whether it be the bigger bands like Slayer or an underground local show from flyers at a CD shop, because without the internet, there was no other way to find out. You have to go through word of mouth. Word of mouth is very unreliable. You might find out that a band you like had played your town 2 weeks after it had happened. Um, Another thing, college radio stations, it would be rare, but they would play death metal too. I recall hearing Mortician for the first time in 1994 before House by the Cemetery, and that was thanks to a Cleveland college radio station. So now it's 1995. I know what local music venues might have death metal. I know what music shops I can go to. The Headbangers Ball had just been canceled because rap music, alternative, industrial, and punk and other forms of music were becoming more popular, whereas heavy metal was now considered dead. And at the time, it was not very fashionable. And in fact, a year later, because heavy metal had fallen out of fashion, Metallica had decided to cut their hair short and, play alternative music. Now, if they'd have done that nowadays, whatever. But at the time, it proved to all the naysayers that heavy metal was dead when Metallica at the time decided to abandon heavy metal. And I remember at the time saying, Metallica's so big, why would they sell out? And everybody's like, no. When Metallica comes out with their next album, it's going to be alternative because that's what's popular now. And I was in such denial. And when Load came out, these people proved me wrong. I was wrong. I thought Metallica was going to stay. Oh my God, I had my head on my ass. Okay, so in 1995, tape trading was still happening, but it was almost over because the internet would come in 1996, and you'd find out these bands from magazines too, and you wouldn't even know what they sound like. You just send them money in the mail, and then a couple weeks later you get like a demo tape or a CD just based on the artwork or the logo. And usually it was good, sometimes it wasn't. And sometimes in magazines like Metal Maniacs or Rip or whatever magazines there were that I would see in the bookstores back then, they would have a list of these top 10 death metal bands. And I would hear names like Possessed, Celtic Frost, Hellhammer, Venom, stuff I had never been exposed to because these bands had had their commercial heyday when I was like 6 years old. And I wouldn't have seen their videos on Headbangers Ball. Quick embarrassing Corpse Grinder story. When I met Corpse Grinder in 1997, I would have been 20 years old at the time. I asked him about playing the song The Exorcist live. At the time, I had no idea it was a Possessed cover. But thankfully, George was not condescending to me. He was very nice, like, oh yeah, that's a song by Possessed. I'm like, oh, okay. Okay, but yeah, and the younger bands at the time, and when I say younger, I mean Cannibal Corpse, Carcass, Deicide. Those bands were much more popular. So fast forward to 1996. In the summer of 1996, that's when the internet became a novelty few people had ever heard of, to becoming a household name. And now you could just email somebody instead of writing a letter. And you could get the information you wanted rather quickly. You still had to buy CDs at the time because Napster and file sharing programs would not occur till 1999. And at this time, we're still 10 years away from YouTube and social media. But at this time, I was getting into more underground death metal bands. Bands that were demo level at the time would have been Mortal Decay, Regurgitation, Flesh Grind, Lividity, Disgorge, Sickness from Florida, Clean Flesh, Repudiation, Scattered Remnants, and at the time, bands like Dying Fetus, Cryptopsy, Nile, and Exhumed, those were considered far out, very underground bands, bands that you'd never think would be long-term successful. Cataclysm at the time, Amon Amarth at the time was considered, pretty far out underground death metal. I was going to local shows again, reading the underground zines, not just the mainstream zines, but stuff that maybe, a person might make 20 copies of, type it, and then print it on his mom's printer or whatever. I was hanging out with like-minded fans, but ultimately, That's how it came and that's how it went. The 90s happened way too quick. They're gone. They're not coming back. So here we are now. So maybe you can post your own video. How did you get into death metal?